As I walked down the dark alleyway, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the safety of my car as soon as possible. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. I came face to face with a tall, imposing figure in a police uniform. He had a menacing look on his face, and I could feel my knees start to shake. "What are you doing here?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. I stuttered and tried to explain that I was just passing through, but he didn't seem to believe me. Before I knew it, he had handcuffed me and was leading me towards his squad car. I protested and tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. As we drove to the police station, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The officer didn't speak a word, and his gaze never left me. I could feel his eyes boring into me, and I knew that something was very wrong. When we arrived at the station, I was thrown into a cold, damp cell. The officer slammed the door shut and left me alone in the darkness. Hours passed, and I could hear the sounds of other prisoners shouting and cursing in nearby cells. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what I had done wrong, but I couldn't come up with anything. As dawn approached, the door to my cell opened, and the officer appeared once again. He looked even more menacing in the light of day, and I shrank back into the corner of my cell. "You're free to go," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "But remember, I'm always watching." I stumbled out of the cell and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I never wanted to be arrested by that creepy, scary police officer ever again. As I stepped out of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, and a cold wind blew through the deserted alleyways. I started to walk home, but my nerves were frayed. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking danger, and every sound made me jump. I knew that I had to get away from this place, but I didn't know how. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps grew louder and more insistent. I started to run, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder, and I spun around to face the officer once again. He grinned at me, and I could see his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I told you I was always watching," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And now, you're mine." I tried to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed me by the collar and dragged me back to the station, his grip like iron. I screamed and struggled, but he didn't seem to care. When we reached the station, he threw me into a cell and locked the door. The darkness closed in around me, and I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. Days passed, and I was left alone in the cell. I didn't know how long I had been there, but it felt like an eternity. I could feel my mind slipping away, and I knew that I had to get out before it was too late. One night, as I lay in my cell, I heard a sound outside the door. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, and I could hear the officer's footsteps approaching. I backed away from the door, but it was too late. The door creaked open, and the officer stepped inside. He was grinning, and I could see his teeth glinting in the dim light. "You're never leaving here," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You're mine forever." As he approached, I could feel a sense of dread wash over me. I knew that I was trapped, and there was no escape. The officer loomed over me, and I could feel his breath on my face. And then, everything went black. As I lay on the cold, hard ground, my head throbbing with pain, I couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. Had I been knocked unconscious by the creepy police officer? Or was this all some bizarre nightmare? I slowly sat up and looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. And then I saw him. The officer was lying next to me, snoring loudly and drooling all over the floor. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. This terrifying police officer was now reduced to a comical figure, snoring like a baby. I got up and stumbled towards the door, but as soon as I touched the handle, I was electrocuted. I jumped back in pain and looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. And then I saw it, a sign above the door that read "Electricity warning, door handle may be electrified." I couldn't believe my luck. Not only was I trapped in a creepy police station, but now I was being electrocuted for trying to escape. I sat back down inside, resigned to my fate. And then, out of nowhere, the officer woke up and started chasing me around the cell, his pants falling down and his belly bouncing up and down. I tried to run, but I couldn't stop laughing. This terrifying figure was now a hilarious clown, stumbling around and tripping over his own feet. And then, as suddenly as it had all started, the officer collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. I looked at him, not knowing whether to laugh or be scared. But then I heard a voice from outside the door. "Police! Open up!" I jumped up and started shouting for help, but the officer just snored on, oblivious to the chaos around him. As the police burst in, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. This was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it was also one of the funniest. And I knew that I would never forget the creepy, scary police officer who turned out to be a bumbling, incompetent fool. As I sat in the cell, waiting for something to happen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. The creepy police officer was still snoring loudly on the ground, and the room was still as dark and cold as before. And then I saw it, a rat scurrying across the floor towards me. I recoiled in disgust, but the rat didn't seem to care. It scampered up my leg and onto my lap, and I could feel its tiny claws scratching at my skin. I tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't budge. And then, to my horror, I realized that there were more rats crawling out of the walls and swarming towards me. They were everywhere, and I was trapped. I screamed and thrashed around, but the rats kept coming. I could feel them biting at my flesh, their sharp teeth tearing through my skin. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the creepy police officer woke up. He looked around in confusion, and then he saw the rats. He screamed and jumped up, flailing around and knocking things over. The rats scattered in all directions, and I scrambled away, trying to put as much distance between me and the officer as possible. But the officer was too fast. He grabbed me by the collar and dragged me towards the door, his eyes wild and his breath hot on my face. "You're never leaving here," he growled, his teeth bared. "You're mine forever." I tried to fight back, but he was too strong. He threw me into a cell and slammed the door shut, trapping me once again. But then, as I sat there in the dark, I heard a sound outside the door. It was the sound of someone unlocking the door. I couldn't believe it. Had someone finally come to rescue me? I waited with bated breath, and then the door swung open. And there, standing in front of me, was the same creepy police officer. But this time, he was wearing a tutu and a tiara, his mustache painted bright pink. He smiled at me and said, "Surprise. I'm actually a ballet dancer, and I've been waiting for someone to appreciate my art." I stared at him in disbelief, not sure whether to laugh or be scared. And then, to my surprise, he started dancing around the cell, pirouetting and twirling like a professional ballerina. I couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. This creepy, scary police officer had turned out to be a talented dancer, and I was trapped in a cell with him. As he danced around, I couldn't help but join in, my fear and anxiety melting away. And even though I was still trapped in the cell, I knew that I was safe, for now. As the officer danced around, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved that he wasn't actually trying to hurt me. But on the other hand, I couldn't believe that he had put me through all of this just for the sake of a prank. Excuse me, I said, trying to get his attention. What's going on here? Is this some kind of joke? The officer stopped dancing and looked at me, his face serious. Yes, it is, he said. I'm sorry if I scared you, but this was all just part of a TV show I'm filming. I stared at him in disbelief. A TV show? What kind of TV show involves scaring innocent people half to death? The officer shrugged. It's a hidden camera show. We set up scenarios like this to see how people react. It's all in good fun. I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. Well, it wasn't very funny, I said. You had me thinking that I was going to die. The officer sighed. I know, and I'm sorry. We didn't mean to take it that far. We'll make sure that you're compensated for your time and any damages that were caused. I nodded, still feeling a little shaken. Okay, but can I leave now? I've had enough excitement for one day. The officer smiled. Of course. I'll escort you out myself. As we walked towards the door, I couldn't help but think about how surreal the whole experience had been. It was like something out of a horror movie, but with a comedic twist. And even though I was still a little angry about the whole thing, I couldn't deny that it was an experience I would never forget. I had been scared, but I had also laughed, and that was something that didn't happen every day. As we stepped out into the sunlight, the officer turned to me and said, "So, what did you think of my dancing?" I couldn't help but smile. It was actually pretty impressive. The officer beamed. Thank you. Maybe I'll make a career out of it. And as I walked away from the creepy, scary police station, I couldn't help but wonder what other surprises life had in store for me. But one thing was for sure, I would never forget the day I got pranked by a police officer who turned out to be a talented ballerina. As I walked away from the police station, I began to feel like something wasn't quite right. The officer's prank had been unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the officer jogging towards me. "Hey, wait up," he called out. I stopped in my tracks and waited for him to catch up. "I forgot to give you something," he said, handing me a small envelope. "It's a release form for the TV show. You need to sign it and send it back to us." I nodded and took the envelope. But as I turned to leave, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the officer's demeanor seemed off. As I walked away, I heard him whisper something under his breath. It was too quiet for me to make out, but it sent shivers down my spine. I quickened my pace, wanting to put some distance between myself and the officer. But as I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing in the middle of the street, was a group of people dressed in black robes. They were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and as I got closer, I could see that they were holding some kind of ritual. I wanted to turn and run, but I felt frozen in place. And then, I heard the officer's voice behind me. "Welcome to the show," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're the star attraction." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on a cold, stone floor. I was in some kind of underground chamber, and the air was thick with the smell of incense. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could see that I was surrounded by the people in black robes. They were staring at me with cold, dead eyes, and I knew that I was in serious trouble. And then, I heard the officer's voice again. "Time to perform," he said. "You're going to be the sacrifice in our ritual." I screamed, but it was too late. The group descended upon me, and I knew that I was going to die. The last thing I heard was the officer's laughter, echoing through the chamber like a mocking bird. And then, everything went black again.